can we please welcome to the stage to discuss Paul McMahon's new book, Feeding Frenzy. Paul McMahon, Aaron Cesar, and Oscar Guardiola. Sorry, I've got that wrong. Oscar Guardiola Rivera.
Sure, that's a Freudian slip. When I was a child, I came across a newspaper article that our most famed novelist, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, had written in the early 50s. It had a very peculiar title. It was titled "The Possibilities of Cannibalism." In a Swift-esque manner, Garcia Marquez was proposing that if things continued the way they were going, the time would come when human flesh would be provided for in supermarkets. Because if we continue to consume our natural resources at the rate we were doing so, the only possibility left at some point in history would be for men and women to feed on each other. Of course, Garcia Marquez was playing a very interesting game here. On the one side, he was reminding his readers about the origins of Latin American literature in the 16th century chroniclers, who invariably would point at the alleged cannibalism of the Amerindians, while at the same time proposing that actually it was modern society, rather than the Amerindians, who were the cannibals. We were cannibalizing our planet. Here we are, 50 years later. The issues which Garcia Marquez talked about have become a real problem, not a possibility, but an actuality for us. And this is precisely what we're here today to talk about with Paul and Aaron. Let me begin with you, Paul. And I have to say this. When I read your book and I looked at the title, Feeding Frenzy, the first thing that came to my mind, just to continue with the cannibalism theme, was a zombie apocalypse. So your premise in the book is that if we do not change course, if we continue the way down the path we're going, we might end up in this post-apocalyptic scenario. Are we any closer to the next zombie apocalypse?
So I think one of the big conclusions of my book is within our control to make that happen or not happen. And a bit of context of why I wrote the book. If you think back to 2008, there was a lot of media articles at the time about the world food crisis. The price of food had doubled or tripled, a lot of commodities. You notice you went to the supermarket, you had less change in your pocket at that time. And at that time as well, a revival of fears of exactly what Oscar was talking about. Are we running out of land, running out of water, running out of food? And Thomas Malthus, the famous 18th century English philosopher and economist, was back in fashion. And there was a number of books written with even more actually graphic titles than mine. Such as World on the Edge, The Coming Famine, people predicting that the sustainable carrying capacity of the planet is 2 or 3 billion people, and we're already at 7, heading towards 9. So that in a way that apocalypse was inevitable. And that's one of the things that motivated me to write the book, because there's been a wealth of new science, new research, new thinking on these topics. And I was trying to synthesize that and put it into a digestible form.
But the most interesting thing I found about your book is that, of course, we tend to think about these potential catastrophes as if they were the consequence of acts of God or acts of nature. But you point out that, in fact, it is up to us.
Yeah.
These are political phenomena. And, of course, we have known this for quite some time. We all know about the famines in Maoist China. We also know about the man-made famines in Victorian India. Why we haven't learned the lesson?
Yeah, I think if you dig into that, the science and research about can we produce enough food for 9 billion people? Well, in biophysical terms, the answer is yes. We actually do have enough land in the world to do it. There's huge yield gaps in the world today, for example. Whereas in Africa, probably the farmers produce 25% of what's technically possible on the land that's already been cultivated. So if we close yield gaps, we can increase food production. Yes, there are issues around water, around oil, and around minerals and other input use, but we can be much more efficient at that. For example, irrigation water, only 1/3 of the irrigation water is actually taken up by plants. 2/3 is wasted, so we can cut down on that waste. So there's lots of things we can do to make it possible to feed 9 million people. And perhaps, I mean, the most obvious evidence is the fact that we already produce enough food for 9 to 10 million people. But it's the fact that about 40% is fed to animals, another 15% is used for biofuels. And so it's not a question of food production, it's access to food and people having the income so they can afford food. And that's where it gets very interesting, because when you start getting into the geopolitics and the economics of food, it can start looking a little bit more scary. And if we look forward to the next 40, 50 years, what we will see is that although the world can produce enough food, we will see growing imbalances in where that food is being produced, because the areas where the most potential is for the increases is not always the places where populations are growing most quickly. So we'll have a more imbalanced food system, and that's going to require more trade. But unfortunately, if you look what happened in 2008, 2009, when we had high food prices, we saw a lot of trade barriers, we saw a lot of competition for resources, we saw countries banning exports and really trying to keep food at home to reduce their prices, even though it's having a terrible effect on the rest of the world. And so I think, as Oscar said, we've always seen politics and the political economy has always been the key driver in determining who goes hungry and who doesn't. And I think if you look forward the next 40, 50 years, that will play out again, but at an international and geopolitical level between regions of the world.
Aaron, if I may, as the man behind the Delfina Foundation, you created this wonderful theme last year, food, the politics of food, and you invited a number of artists to react to it. Why did you do so, and how did these artists react? And you have some images with you, so...
well, I think firstly, probably Oscar to say is I think like the apocalypse is actually a very useful framework to think about how we change the world.
Well, we're in a church after all, so
very, very, very telling. I mean, it's about returning to basics in many ways, but also the idea of the apocalypse is also an idea of science fiction and what is possible within science fiction with technology, and how can we adapt and adjust and shift the way in which we can think about the future. And I think that the arts create a wonderful kind of platform for that thinking. And so at Delfina Foundation for the last year, we've begun the first of what will be at least a 4-year kind of research period with artists, curators, cultural practitioners, but also working with scientists, anthropologists to think about kind of the politics of food distribution, production, and consumption. And to do so through the arts, through the contemporary arts. And this is not just about painting pretty pictures. It's about raising awareness of kind of key issues in society, but then thinking beyond that awareness. How can creative thinking also create change at the same time? So I'm going to quickly whip through some images here. Some will be irrelevant for this context because I just put some together for a previous lecture. But firstly to say what you're seeing here now is kind of Delfina Foundation and us eating. We invite artists to spend up to 3 months in Victoria, which is at the heart of London. And it's important to be at the seat of kind of British government discussing such kind of relevant projects. So again, like the artists in the kitchen, cooking and eating. Our concerns around food came about, because of all of your concerns about food, kind of watching how certain movements around the world were becoming much more aware of issues around food justice, food security, in Europe. Primarily we had the Occupy movements, which were of course kind of inspired by kind of the Arab Spring, which is also kind of fueled by kind of rising kind of food prices as well, which kind of sort of Paul alluded to in regards to kind of export bans, which led to this. And of course, thinking more about kind of the Middle East, in Syria and other places where food is being used as a pawn in a political game, like as an all too real version of the Hunger Games being played out kind of in the Middle East. In terms of kind of art and food, I mean, the history goes back, of course, to the still life, to artists actually raising awareness of corruption by painting rotten fruit and vegetables, or Archimbolos looking at the body politic and identity through kind of food, which we reference and return back to this idea of kind of identity, cultural preservation, but also cultural ratification sometimes you see through food. In the case of maybe Palestine and Gaza, there's a great book in the shop now called The Gaza Kitchen, which tells the story of Gaza through food and through food pathways, and how back to normal, the basics, to the adobe kind of oven has been fueled by the fact there is no fuel in Gaza. And what's happened is allowed the populace there to kind of reimagine their villages through recipes. Although the villages may not exist, kind of the recipes still do in regards to kind of food. So kind of starting with these images, you can kind of go off into many different tangents. I'm gonna go really quickly through some. The Futurists were like one of the first kind of collectivist artists to produce a manifesto for futurist cookery, which called for an abolition kind of dry pasta, because they said actually it was the enemy of modernism and speed. It just makes you feel, slow and lazy. And also Murray Oppenheim was a wonderful muse for us, who created this furry teacup. And what it does, it takes this very feminine kind of like object, but gives it a little bit of a bite, a little bit of a kick, which goes back into issues around kind of power and gender in relation to food and also to politics. Gordon Matta Clark's most famous kind of food restaurant. This is the first kind of like, I guess highly noted platform for artists using kind of the idea of the dinner as a medium to kind of talk about different social issues. So in New York, this is in Soho, it was a very different place then, lots of prostitutes, fast foods were taking over America, yet they set up this space. It was about like basic cooking, often serving vegetarian meals and doing performance as well as part of it. This is Michael Wakowitz, who's an Iraqi Jewish artist from America, who's been using his heritage and food as a way of talking about conflict, particularly in an American context. And this is an image of him doing it, I think in Chicago, but in London, he was telling me about his most recent iteration of this project in New York. But food being this tool to kind of open up those conversations and to kind of dispel kind of stereotypes, because where you may not necessarily want the Pakistan living next to you, you might eat his cuisine. And it kind of is very telling of our kind of society. Anyway, to go kind of forth, there's not only artists in the West who've been doing this, also artists in the East. This is Amar Kinwar, who Paul, I think you probably find this a lot of kind of really fascinating, because he's been talking about kind of land grab in India and also corporate takeover of landscape, and how in India there's an extraordinary amount of farmer suicides. And so he's been documenting grains of rice alongside individual stories of these farmers who've been basically fighting for their property, but also their human rights. And then I should probably just stop because I talked a lot, but this is a work by Cynthia Molinos.
We all love his voice.
Sorry, like 5-minute art history, food and art kind of lesson. She's an artist who's based in Cairo, but she's Spanish, and she's been looking at kind of Egypt, which was of course the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, but also Egypt today, and in terms of kind of the revolution, which is of course fueled by kind of rising kind of food prices, when kind of Egypt could absolutely kind of sustain itself, but unfortunately because of policy, because of politics, it's this inability to, for people to make kind of, basically survive. And so what happened in 2011 was, after watching what happened in Tunisia, which was started by a fruit and vegetable seller setting himself on fire. And apparently when he struck the match, he said, how do you expect me to make a living like this? That then rippled into Egypt. And anyway, what my point is about showing this is that artists have been kind of responding to this and trying to unpick kind of these issues alongside kind of their fellow citizens, but also that's then another way of creative thinking that we need to influence politics, because we can feed.
The other side of the story, as you just pointed out, is what is happening to those who grow the food and produce it.
Incredible.
I just came back a couple of days ago from the Canary Islands in Spain, which used to be a hub of an agricultural hub. And the Canarians are deeply worried because there are no peasants left. And of course this is happening throughout Europe and elsewhere in the world. So
Can I just respond
both
to
of
that
you,
for a sec?
Paul
Because-
and Adam,
yeah.
who is going to grow our food?
It's been interesting you raised, because this artist, through her residency, she spent 3 months with us in London. And this is an old project of this artist, but her most recent project, which came out of her residency, looks at hunger as a man-made kind of notion and concept, but also looking at who's actually starving. And because all of her work is about peasantry, in fact, and work with farmers. And what she did was a series of different kind of mathematical graphs, taking the same thinking and logic done in a futures market, and applied it to kind of who's eating, who's not eating. And in the case of farmers, of course, they're selling their, as you know, they're underselling kind of their food into the marketplace. And then they have to return back to that marketplace to buy their own food to survive. And so they are the ones who are kind of hungry. So now how do we solve this issue?
And it's one of the perverse ironies of the world that 1 in 8 people go hungry today, and of those people, about 75% are farmers, live in rural areas, and so it's the people who rely on the land are the ones who are going hungry. And why is that? Well, it's partly it can be due with they don't maybe have the tools and the knowledge and the infrastructure to grow more, but it's as much to do with the structure of the markets and what they get for the food. And I think it does raise a very interesting question of what is food worth? And what is the right price for food? Because a lot of the assumptions which come out in the last few years when we saw food prices spike is that high food prices are a bad thing, and we need to get them down because they spark riots, they create hunger and so on. Yeah. But it's only that example of India that Aaron used, where most of those Indian suicides were happening in the 90s when food prices were very, very low. The World Bank did a study of rural poverty in India over the last, I think, 5-6 years. Poverty has gone down because food prices have gone up. And so sometimes higher food prices are exactly what farmers need. So that actually get a proper income and are paid what their labour is worth. So I think that's going to be a huge issue for our time. That era of cheap food we could all rely on in the 80s and 90s when the world was full of surpluses and all this subsidised overproduction and you can go and buy a hamburger for 20 pence. Well, maybe that's over, and that food prices will rebalance where the urban consumers need to pay a bit more, but then that means that the farmers, the people living on the land, can actually earn a proper living.
Two thoughts on that point before Aaron comes back. The first one, of course, the situation you're describing takes us back to domestic history, to Scottish history, to the clearances, to the consequences of the clearances, to what happened to the peasants who were driven off the land. I'm saying this also as a Colombian. We're in the middle of a peace process which hopefully will bring to an end a 50-year-old war, which started precisely when peasants were driven off the land. And another consequence of that was the politicization of those peasants. And I'm thinking of one whose name we all remember, Thomas Paine, whose work on liberty was mainly on agrarian liberty. And he was hoping that America would be the land where agrarian liberty would grow. It seems as if we went on a detour somewhere along that history. That's the first thought. The second thought comes from something that Aaron mentioned, but also from something that Peter mentioned yesterday, and Luke Harding also. This idea that we are forgetting that we think and feel with our hands, the tactility. What I love about the images that you were presenting to us is that when we cook, we once more relate to the world with our hands. It's all about tactility. And this may have something to do with what Luke Harding was telling us yesterday about the fact that some people might be going back to the 1980s because all this technology and so on and so forth were under surveillance. So we may end up resorting to Adobe ovens and typewriters. And that might not be such a bad thing after all, which of course brings me back to the Luddites. Suddenly history becomes a narrative that is with us here and now. Is it the case that because of our not dependence on technology, but our increasing abstraction without the traction, this flight into virtuality, we have forgotten about the fact that food needs to be grown, that the land matters, that water matters, that these issues are still with us?
Yeah, and the importance of soil, I think most important, because we've forgotten what soil is, and at the most we look at the very top of it, and maybe the top sort of few millimeters, but actually soil is probably the most, it's the most impressive living organism that exists on the planet, sustains all life on this planet, and it is a biological system of enormous complexity we're only beginning to understand. A lot of my work, both in the book, but also my day job where I help run an investment business, we've seen a big debate between the future of farming. On the one hand, is technology is seen as the answer, where people are focused on GM and precision agriculture and satellites and all the sort of the gizmos which technological advances can give you. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people finding solutions in ecology and a deeper understanding of ecology and biology, and that can be just actually as science-based, and it can be as sophisticated or more sophisticated science, trying to understand how microbes interact with the fungi and the bacteria, and how these complicated food webs actually exist and how you get the most out of them. But from my point of view, I think that there is a huge potential understanding more about those ecological interactions, working how to tweak and manipulate them so we can produce more food in a sustainable way, while not giving up on some of the benefits of technology too. But I think that the techno-optimists can get a little bit carried away and think that that will save the day.
You remind me that earlier this year I was invited to give a lecture at the British Museum. I'm talking about a dream come true. And the lecture was on whether natural resources were a blessing or a curse. And of course, as you just pointed out, it is up to us. It is not an act of God. It's neither a blessing nor a curse. We make it so. But also, I would love to think that right now there is a possibility for the most updated and best science on climate change, for instance, to converge with the historical legacy of Amerindians and Aborigines thinking. And perhaps, I mean, wouldn't it be a wonderful case of poetic justice if those we thought had been consigned to the dustbin of history would be actually the only ones who could save our modern soul?
Yes.
And our hands, of course. How are we doing on time? Because I'm pretty sure there are plenty of questions, and
20 minutes.
20 minutes.
Well,
Perfect.
no, just
So let's just one final
just slightly kind of comment on that. I think our connection, like going back to the idea of kind of touch, kind of to the land is very separate, because of course there's a huge division between the rural kind of and the urban. Even I myself, I come from a family of farmers. I live from Louisiana. I live in London. And I look back at kind of that way of life. And of course, when I was growing up, I knew immediately just that wasn't the life kind of for me. But also I have 3 other siblings, and none of them also decided to be a farmer either. Because where I grew up is quite corrupt, worldwide, also in America. It's also a place where obesity as well as malnourishment can exist and in the same person. If that kind of makes sense. And that's also kind of a relationship between kind of policies. But also, one of the last performative dinners that we did at Delfina Foundation was during the time of all the flooding in Britain. And was called How Do We Share in Times of Crises? And we ate a lamb that was slaughtered because of the floods. This lamb was not going to survive. It was by a farmer out in Dorset. And this lamb was given to her daughter, who lives in London, who's an artist, who cooked the lamb for us. And so the whole point of this exercise was actually say, we had no connection to a farmer, and there was a time of crisis. How do we survive in that kind of regard? But also the idea of sharing, and actually in cities we don't share as much as you do in the rural context. So I think that there's something really dangerous about that as well, that complete kind of separation to land, and so we do need to return to the adobe oven, to the basics.
But Paul, can we share given the present market system? I love the fact that you come from the side of business. You're not just another crazy deep ecology eco warrior. You're coming from that world. But the question needs to be asked. We don't have a relationship with the farmers and the peasants, among other things, because all we see is Tesco and Sainsbury's. My daughter might be shocked to that. Well, actually, part of her family has a farm in Wiltshire, so she knows milk comes from cows, not cartoons. But we don't have that tactile connection anymore. Isn't it the case that it is because of the market system that we have that we not only don't have that relationship, but access to food is suffering?
And I think we do need to fundamentally reshape, the market environment in which farmers operate and consumers operate. I think at the same that there are some deep trends which are happening at the moment which are going to push things in this new direction anyway. So one is high oil prices. I think one of the greatest incentives for energy efficiency, for lower input farming systems, for weaning land off chemical fertilizers is oil at $100 a barrel. I mean, that's had a huge impact on making people stop and think, how can I, purely from an economic point of view, how do I reduce my costs? and being more creative and looking for other ways to farm manage land. I think that's one factor. I think second factor is an increasing consumer awareness of the differences between food. You know, to Aaron's point, where you can have malnourishment and obesity in the same person. You know, and I think the food system is broken in so many ways. So I mentioned the 1 in 8 people who go hungry in the world. Well, so 1 in 5 are overweight. And there's huge issues with lack of micronutrients as well. And so the food system isn't delivering on almost any dimension. And I think consumers are being more aware of that and trying to seek out food which is not only produced the right way, which is healthier and full of nutrients and which is better for them and for their families. But I think at the same time, to really make those shifts, yeah, we do need changes in policy, you know, where we have sometimes subsidies in place which don't encourage the right behavior. And there's a lot of what they call environmental externalities, you know, in the pollution and soil degradation, greenhouse gas emissions, which are effectively free, you know, and so in a way, you know, farmers are getting a free lunch to deliver our dinner to some extent. And if all those environmental impacts were priced and there was a cost in those, well then again, people would change how they manage the land and we see different kind of food systems emerge. So I think we need a mixture of all those. I think it's the economics will drive some, I think consumer choice will drive some, but I think we need also new and better policies as well.
So we need to change not only the way we think, but the terms of the conversation, which makes it very important that Aaron and the Delfina Foundation are bringing artists and making art a new medium, a new language, a way of researching into these subjects. It's time for questions. I'm pretty sure you have quite a few, so let's begin here.
Thanks. Can I pick up on that last point? And I'm sort of thinking back 2-3 years now when Michael Mansfield was here at Beyond Borders, and he was talking about personal change and his journey in terms of personal change, and in a way alluded to some of the things that you've, in fact both of you said in different ways. And one was, he was focusing particularly on red meat, and there was the opportunity cost which you've alluded to in terms of all the foods, the soya, the wheat, the barley, which is fed to cattle. But there's also, and it's a point I think you might have alluded to in your last sort of, your last bit, which was to do with the hidden costs of sort of, especially red meat production. I'm thinking in terms of methane, which is not, you know, there's, you know, you've not really sort of touched on it, but actually the whole global warming cost of actually basically eating beef. And I don't know whether you could actually sort of
That's a topic it's a topic close to my heart actually, and it's a wonderful example of actually how complicated some of these issues are, because it's very easy for people to say we shouldn't eat meat, we should all become vegetarians, and then we would solve a lot of the problems. But I think it is where you have to separate between the ways in which meat is produced, because there are some very environmentally damaging systems which destroy soils, which use huge amounts of grains, which can be very negative for in terms of methane and carbon emissions. But there are also sustainably produced livestock systems which can be quite positive for the environment. And if animals are used in the right way as part of some arable rotation, they have a positive impact on the land. The methane is fascinating because the science in that at the moment is quite one-dimensional, where everyone focuses on the methane coming out of the animals. There's a lot of work being done about understanding what happens in the soil, where you actually have bacteria in the soil who eat the methane from in the atmosphere and put it back in the soil. And we're only beginning to understand the full cycling of methane in the atmosphere. It's another example of how our science and knowledge of what happens under the ground is very, very limited. So I think over time we will get a fuller understanding of the true greenhouse gas emission effects of some of these farming systems. And I do think the grain-intensive feedlot system has a lot of issues. But I think pasture-based lamb and cattle production in Scotland, for example, around here, is probably the most sustainable form of land use, you know, for these landscapes. So overall, I think we probably need to moderate our meat consumption, but not give it up altogether. That'd be my personal.
What do you think about the concept that, for example, Farmers Union in Latin America are using of soberanía alimentaria, food sovereignty, as an element to challenge this situation?
Yeah, I think it's hugely important, and we've alluded as well, the idea of food citizenship as well, all becoming good food citizens as consumers, producers, all the way along the supply chain. Yeah, in developing countries, a lot of these issues are actually much more raw and much more existential. I mean, they really, really matter. And I think Oscar alluded to it as well. I mean, we've seen these sort of pendulums swinging in history about land ownership, you know, where we have times we get huge concentrations of land, whether it's aristocrats, whether it's corporates, you know, owning the land, and people will be employed as tenants, as serfs, whatever, working the land. And then we've also got the pendulum swinging the other way, where everything is broken up, land gets redistributed. And whether that's in Ireland, where I'm from, the 19th century, China throughout history has done that 2 or 3 times. They break everything up and give it and distribute it. And I think people, if you look at the economics of development, the countries who develop the most democratic and equal ways tend to have a more equal distribution of land. It may not be tiny plots of 1 hectare each, but it's that kind of mid-scale, medium-scale farmer, which is almost the bedrock of American democracy and European democracy as well. I think what people are worried about in South America, it's happening now a little bit in Africa, where we are getting land grabs and foreign companies and big enterprises coming in, trying to recreate in a way a industrialized large-scale farming model, and pushing people off the land, and that I think can cause terrible problems because people end up in the favelas, in the slums. It's not a good model for economic development. And so I think there's a lot of merit in that. And I always, in the book I talk with this, I think countries can learn a lot by looking to the east and looking at what's happened, for example, in Vietnam or in Thailand, where they have actually achieved really good rates of economic development and rural development, poverty reduction and hunger reduction, all while keeping small farmers on the land, and by investing in small farmers, building infrastructure, helping them produce, and that has been an incredibly important, powerful engine for developing those countries. And I think we can all learn from a lot from that.
Lady?
I wonder what kind of civic movement or purposeful civil society engagement can take place with the supermarkets, who have quite extraordinary strangleholds on those who supply them, to the extent that at the moment even the knobbly vegetables may not be given to food banks. So it seems to me quite extraordinary. One can understand they have quality thresholds to be met, but they also require to exercise a greater degree of corporate social responsibility. And it was addressed in some measure at the food security event at the Scottish Parliament, the Festival of Politics last week. But that kind of stranglehold in a period of austerity is quite unsuitable.
I think that's probably why. How effective do people think the Occupy movements were? It was a voice that came out, it was really strong, but at the same time, it was a disconnect between actually how do you actually speak kind of truth kind of to power. It really is, I think, a conundrum kind of for us to try and find ways to kind of communicate with supermarkets in that way. And I think to some degree it's beginning to kind of, we're trying to work with them. Very much in terms of thinking about our space and as artists. It's not about working in isolation in the gallery or in the studio, but how do you kind of engage people in a very meaningful way. It takes a lot of time. Often those radical changes happen when there's an economic impact kind of on them. So maybe there's another way of thinking about how do you affect them in that way, whether it actually is through deciding to buy less of Tesco's and Sainsbury's and more of Waitrose and whatever. I don't know what the solution is, but right now what we're trying to do over the next 4 years is think about those particular issues and also to work with activists as much as we work with farmers and artists at the same time to think about it the right way, the right means of adjusting that.
Your question, if I may, reminded me of a wonderful documentary in which I took part a few years ago, Making Poverty History. A lady historian from Chicago put it very bluntly. Only when the poor and the peasants organize themselves politically, only then they obtain results. Only if we organize politically, we can push and put pressure on those giants. And mind you, it is happening right now. Again, just coming back from Spain, I was mesmerized by the political earthquake which is taking place there and in the rest of Southern Europe. A new political movement which did not exist as such a year ago is now breaking up, on the verge of breaking up a political model which sustains those economic interests. And that is happening not in Asia, not in Latin America, because we always think that revolutions can only happen over there. It's happening here in Europe. And of course, there is the future of the United Kingdom after the Scottish referendum, which is not only about yes or no. It is about a constitution, what constitution, whether or not we can discuss politically and legally cultural and economic issues, which at present we cannot. So there are ways in which things can happen. Please.
How do you feel that rewilding will fit into a future vision of agriculture and food? And in particular, what about the role of hill sheep farming, which has been so strongly criticised by George Monbiot?
Fascinating question. I think so. The work we do, for example, we really like systems which mimic nature. I think you can learn a huge amount by understanding how nature works in the wild. But at the same time, I think the reality is, as a species, we control this planet to a large extent. The Anthropocene that we're living in, we have this incredible geological impact on this planet. So we're almost like the gardeners, and the planet in a way is our garden now, whether we like it or not.
You're beginning to sound like an Amazonian.
Yeah. They have a point. And the question is, how do we design and manage that garden to deliver the outcomes which we want, which is health and prosperity and dignity for the people now, but also for all the future generations to come. Like the true definition of sustainability. And I think in that, for sure, there's a place for wild areas, and that's a great joy and benefit to us, able to go to those wild areas and appreciate and enjoy them. We may some of them even believe that wild animals, other species, have rights in themselves, which should be respected and protected in those areas. But I think we need to spend a lot more time thinking that the land which isn't wild, and which is never going to be going back to be wild, how do we manage that better so that it is more sustainable? Hill sheep farming is a great example, because I'm doing some work at the moment with sheep farmers in Chile, in Patagonia in the south, where they're suffering terrible problems of degradation, overgrazing. And there's a different way of managing animals called holistic management, which is all about putting sheep in big flocks, putting them into much smaller paddocks, using fencing to divide the land up, and moving around the landscape. And if you manage the animals in a better way, you actually can bring back vegetation, you can put more carbon in the soil, you can increase biodiversity of all the other species too. So I think there's so many things we can do to improve how we manage land at the moment without having to just put a fence around it and walk away.
Yeah, you mentioned the rural poverty, all part of the Pacific, bits of that here. I come from the northeast of Scotland. There are some very well off, if not rich farmers who are farming with subsidies. And I'd like your view on whether things like the CAP are sustainable going forward. Who makes our food, who farms our food is a huge question, because I can show you any number of guys who are going to be their last generation farming their farms because their children can make 3, 4, 5 times the money doing virtually anything else. But my question really is, in terms of production, dwarf wheat was a step change in getting that production better all over the world. Do you think it's time we bit the bullet and accept that genetic modification might be the way forward?
My view in the book actually on GM, I'm agnostic in genetic modification. I think we should absolutely keep exploring the science behind it and looking for innovations which can perhaps deliver some kind of breakthrough. But I also think it's not the silver bullet, and the reality of GM at the moment, where it is being used in the US and South America widely, it isn't delivering necessarily higher yields. I mean, what it does is make it simpler for the farmer to manage the land, but it also locks them into a pretty high input system dependent on herbicides and seeds in certain companies. So we
also just had riots in Colombia last year because
really, of that. So it's also
Monsanto.
It's a risky. You're a little bit dealing with the devil on that one, and you can maybe make it work for you, but you're also locked into a very expensive system. And if you get resistant weeds, which is happening now in the US quite a bit, well, you're going to start all over again. So I think so far it hasn't been so bad. I also think there's lots of other more ecological, let's say, systems out there which can deliver very good yields, which can get us to where we need to be actually. So we don't have to wait for GM. There's lots of ways we can improve things with the technology and the science we have. But I'm not, I don't rule it out. Could we have organic GMs? Perhaps. Could, if someone invents crops which require less nutrients, which are better for the environment, better users of water, could they be part of a sustainable farming system? Yes, I'm open to that. I think that let's keep doing the science, keep doing the research on it.
Right. Is it wrong to suggest that the problem is a lack of water or food, but it's the growth of population?
Well, it's interesting.
Please, Mr. Malthus.
If you look, the population of the planet went up by 2.5 times in 1950 and 2000, and our food production tripled. So food production outpaced population growth. Now we're looking forward to a time where population now about 7.2 billion is going to get to about 9.3 billion 2050-ish. But then it's going to grow slower and slower and slower and peak probably somewhere around 10 in the late 2000s. So actually we're only going to go from 7 to 9 or 10. So that's less than a 50% increase. So if you look at history, what we've been able to achieve, you look forward, what's coming down the track. Yes, there are challenges, but I think, I don't think population growth is necessarily the issue in global terms. I think, we have the land, we have resources, if managed well, to meet that need. And going back to what I said before, we could already feed 9 or 10 billion people, so we produce enough food. So it isn't really the amount of production, it's the way it's shared and accessed. Having said that, I do think that at local, regional levels, we may see some Malthusian-type traps and problems coming out. So if you look, for example, at South Asia, and this is kind of a bit of what worries me most, you take India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. I mean, there the population is predicted to grow from, I think, about 1.7 billion people there now to 2.4 billion by 2050. So that's 700 million extra people on a land which is already almost totally used. There's going to be 400 million more Indians and Chinese in 2050. And so that part of the world, stressed for water, soils, everything else, it's going to find it very hard to feed itself. We'll have to rely on world markets. And that's where some of the geopolitical issues come up as well. Where is that food going to come from? How will it be traded? And can they access it? So I think at a regional level there are issues, but at global terms we can do it.
My daughter is going to be very disappointed to learn that the Hunger Games are not going to happen after all. Aaron, I wanted to ask you to tell us more about the way in which art is not only reacting to these new issues, but recreating itself in the process.
Well, I guess I'd point kind of somewhat to this image that happens just to be here, because it's probably one of the last images we'll be able to show, which is actually a work by a Palestinian artist called Larissa Sansour, who also created a work which is actually happens to be the next slide, called Soup over Bethlehem, Malakia. And she's currently, well, let me go back to the first image. So the first image is that she recreated the whole nation of Palestine in a tall tower block building as a way of kind of rethinking kind of global politics, but also thinking about issues around kind of surveillance, access to land, to property rights, but also to just to culture. But as part of thinking about science fiction, she also thought about future foods in relation to kind of Palestine. And for this other work that I showed you here of Malakia, one of the things they're pointing out in this particular slide is that the best Malakia is from Jericho, where a lot of Palestinians cannot travel to because of checkpoints. So she's now working with a scientist to actually develop and adapt maybe a genetically modified type of Malakia that can be grown outside of Palestine and in kind of different kind of contexts. So it's amazing how her practice, which this film was produced 10 years ago, and then the latest film which I showed you, which was this film was done like a year ago, in between the thinking of her as an artist, she's been able to kind of work with scientists to actually think about making a much larger way of kind of preserving kind of this very kind of wholesome and amazing kind of Palestinian dish. I'll stop there.
I think we have time for one last question, probably.
Yes. Can I ask some? With regard to food production and technological developments, I read a book, it was written in 2012. It was talking about hydroponics, aeroponics, that it would use much less energy, much less water, no pesticides at all. And they were talking that a tower block or something could feed like 50,000 people. What role do you see of these new advances in technology in feeding the world in the future?
Yeah, it's interesting because every few years there's always sort of a new thing, which is going to revolutionize our food systems and solve all our problems. And hydroponics has been touted as one of those next things. When I've seen, where it is being used at the moment, it is being used actually to an extent in the Gulf, where they are using these growing vegetables in the desert effectively in water and basically dissolved nutrients, to grow fruits and vegetables. It's extremely expensive. It works there because the cost of imports is extremely high. There's also some interesting subsidies around it, and there's a voracious local market with no other options. So yes, you can do it. You can do a lot of things, but it's extremely expensive. And I don't know if it's ever going to get a whole lot cheaper because there are reasons why the power photosynthesis is based on the amount of sunlight coming from the sun, and that's why extensive systems using flat open areas or fields, have developed, because that's where you harvest so much sunlight. And some of those vertical hydroponic systems, I always just wondered, there's the efficiency of sunlight conversion, how you make that work. So yeah, in localized environments where there aren't other options, there's probably a role, but I think it's going to feed the world.
I forget the details, but the title of the book is Abundance 2012. It was written in sunlight, but they would create their whole energy. He's talking a lot about burning animal waste, so to speak, and gaining energy from that, and it sounded like a real fairy tale solution to the world's problems, but I don't know if that there's any basis to that.
Abundance 2012?
Well, that's a perpetual motion machine. It has to come from the sun. That's where energy comes
But also,
from.
I'll just say quickly, I mean, you pointed out in your book, I think it was your book, the fact that actually we have resources that we're just not using. I mean, there were 250,000, this is you from your book, edible plants in the world, and only 250 of them we actually kind of eat regularly, out of 250,000 edible plants in the world. So I mean, I don't know if we need to like do technology. Actually, there is kind of like an abundance in our planet that we're just not using because they're not fashionable, kind of, for example. So kind of next year, in terms of the themes that we're taking on within our program, the politics of food, one theme is sex, one theme is diet, one theme is disaster. And kind of within diet, though, we're looking at...
It's the same thing.
Within diet, we're looking at kind of issues around kind of ritual, religion, and fashion. And I think kind of fashion dictates a lot of kind of what we eat as well, and kind of what we consume and what we think is edible. So, I mean, I think the possibilities are there.
Ladies and gentlemen, Aaron Caesar, Paul McMahon.